In 2006, Google spent $1.65 billion buying YouTube. Today, that sounds obvious, almost boring. Of course, Google bought YouTube. Of course, YouTube became one of the most valuable acquisitions in history. Of course, billions of people ended up watching videos online, but that's only because we know how the story ends. Back then, the deal looked insane. YouTube wasn't profitable. It wasn't producing original content. It wasn't dominating culture. It wasn't even 2 years old. Some analysts genuinely believed Google had just spent $1.65 billion on a website full of copyright violations and grainy home videos. Yet that's not the strangest part of the story. The strangest part is that around the same time, Google was staring directly at another company that would eventually reshape entertainment just as dramatically as YouTube. Netflix. And almost nobody thought it mattered. If you walked into a meeting in 2005 and claimed that Netflix would one day spend more money on content than many Hollywood studios, people would have laughed. Not because they were stupid, because Netflix didn't look like the future. It looked like a DVD company. That's the first thing you need to understand. Today, Netflix feels inevitable. In 2005, it felt ordinary. The company had roughly 4.2 million subscribers. Sounds impressive until you compare it to television. American Idol regularly attracted more than 25 million viewers in a single night. One show, one evening, 6 times Netflix's entire subscriber base. That's how small Netflix looked. That's how easy it was to dismiss. Meanwhile, Google was dealing with a completely different problem. It was winning too much. Revenue exploded from roughly $86 million in 2001 to more than $6 billion by 2005. Search dominated the internet. Advertisers loved Google. Investors loved Google. Wall Street loved Google. Yet inside the company, there was a growing fear. What comes next? Because Google remembered Yahoo. Younger viewers might not realize this, but Yahoo once looked unstoppable. At its peak, it was one of the most visited websites on Earth. Then Google arrived and changed everything. Larry Page and Sergey Brin understood exactly how quickly dominance could disappear because they had built the company responsible for that disappearance. Search made Google powerful. But what if search wasn't enough? What if people spent less time looking for information and more time consuming entertainment? That's the question nobody could answer. The internet was changing in ways that felt subtle at first and obvious only later. Broadband internet was spreading rapidly. Millions of households were upgrading from dial-up. Video consumption was increasing. People were spending more time online than ever before. The internet wasn't simply becoming useful. It was becoming entertaining. Then YouTube appeared. At first, it looked insignificant. The first video uploaded to the platform lasted just 19 seconds. Nobody watching it could have predicted what would happen next. Within months, growth exploded. By 2006, users were watching around 100 million videos every day. Every day. Think about that. Netflix had 4.2 million subscribers. YouTube had 100 million daily video views. Suddenly, the future looked very different. But here's something most people don't know. Google wasn't watching from the sidelines. It already had its own video platform, Google Video. Almost nobody remembers it today because it failed spectacularly. Yet, for a brief moment, Google genuinely believed it had already solved online video. The company had world-class engineers, massive infrastructure, enormous resources, one of the strongest brands on the internet. It should have won. Instead, users kept choosing YouTube. Why? Because technology isn't always the deciding factor. Google Video felt like a product. YouTube felt like a place. One platform allowed people to upload videos, the other made people want to. That distinction sounds tiny. It wasn't. Silicon Valley has learned the same lesson repeatedly. Technology can be copied. Communities are much harder to copy. Google could recreate features. It couldn't instantly recreate millions of users spending hours on a platform because they genuinely enjoyed being there. And here's an even stranger detail. In some cases, Google Video actually charged users for content, while YouTube gave video away for free. One company looked like software, the other looked like a movement. Google realized it had a problem, fast. Then things got worse. YouTube's growth became almost frightening. By some estimates, the company was consuming enormous amounts of bandwidth while generating very little revenue. Some analysts believed YouTube's biggest threat wasn't competition, it was survival. The more successful the platform became, the more expensive it became to operate. Every uploaded video created another bill. Every view created another bill. Every viral clip created another bill. Imagine building a business where growth itself becomes a financial risk. That's essentially what YouTube was facing. Google solved that problem overnight. Suddenly, YouTube had access to Google's infrastructure, Google's engineers, and Google's money. Looking back, the acquisition seems obvious. At the time, it felt like a gamble. But while everyone was talking about YouTube, Netflix was quietly collecting something arguably more valuable than DVDs: data. Not search data, not social media data, entertainment data. Every movie rating, every rental, every abandoned queue, every preference. Netflix knew what people actually watched. That's a very different thing from knowing what people claim to like. And the company became obsessed with it. In 2006, Netflix announced something that sounded completely ridiculous: a $1 million competition. Not for filmmakers, not for actors, not for writers, for mathematicians. The challenge was simple: improve Netflix's recommendation algorithm by at least 10% and win $1 million. $1 million. For math. Think about how unusual that sounded at the time. Facebook wasn't famous for recommendation systems yet. TikTok didn't exist. Modern AI hype was still years away. Yet Netflix was already treating data like a strategic weapon. More than 50,000 teams from around the world eventually participated. Researchers spent years working on the problem. Some of the resulting techniques influenced future recommendation systems. Years before people worried about algorithms controlling attention, Netflix was investing heavily in understanding what viewers wanted to watch next. And that's where the Google angle becomes fascinating. Because if Google was becoming the king of search data, Netflix was quietly becoming the king of entertainment data. Yet Netflix still looked boring. Investors love exciting stories. YouTube was exciting. It was chaotic, unpredictable, and growing at absurd speed. Netflix mailed DVDs. In fact, by 2007, Netflix was shipping roughly 1.9 million DVDs every single day. Every day. Warehouses processed mountains of discs. Trucks moved inventory across the country. Sorting centers worked around the clock. This wasn't the image of a futuristic technology company. It looked more like a logistics operation. That's exactly why so many people underestimated it. The future rarely arrives looking futuristic. Sometimes it arrives disguised as a business nobody finds particularly interesting. And that's what made Google's decision so difficult. Because Google wasn't choosing between success and failure. It was choosing between different versions of the future. One future looked like user-generated content. The other looked like premium entertainment. One future eventually became YouTube. The other eventually became Netflix. Today, it feels obvious that Google should have wanted both. Reality wasn't nearly that simple. Every acquisition consumes money, leadership attention, resources. Companies don't buy the future. They place bets on what they think the future might become. Google looked at YouTube and saw explosive growth. It looked at Netflix and saw a DVD company with a few million subscribers. History makes one of those choices look obvious. History always does that. But the people making the decision didn't have history. They had uncertainty. And uncertainty can make even the smartest companies look surprisingly human. What makes this even stranger is that Google wasn't wrong. That's the part most people miss. Google bought YouTube and won, spectacularly. Netflix stayed independent and won, spectacularly. Both companies ended up helping define modern entertainment. The difference is that they did it separately. But imagine for a moment that things had gone differently. Imagine Google owning Search, Android, Chrome, YouTube, and Netflix at the same time. Imagine opening YouTube and seeing Netflix originals promoted across the homepage. Imagine House of Cards launching as a Google property. Imagine Stranger Things living inside the same ecosystem as Gmail and Android. That's not just a technology company anymore. That's an entertainment empire. And the scary part? For a brief moment, that future wasn't impossible. It was one decision away. If you asked most Hollywood executives in 2008 whether Netflix could threaten television, many would have laughed. Not because they hated Netflix, because the idea sounded ridiculous. The company still mailed DVDs. Streaming was tiny. Internet speeds frustrated users. The catalog looked weak. Television had spent decades winning. Why would anyone believe a website could replace that? But Hollywood had already made this mistake before. The industry underestimated home video, then cable television, then the internet. Now it was underestimating streaming again. One executive described Netflix as a useful distribution partner, not a competitor, not a threat, not the future, a partner. Years later, that assessment would look catastrophic. The first warning sign appeared somewhere nobody expected. Not in a boardroom, not on Wall Street, in customer behavior. Netflix noticed something strange. When people streamed content, they behaved differently. They watched multiple episodes in a row. They finished seasons faster. They came back more often. Traditional television was built around weekly schedules. Netflix users ignored schedules whenever they had the chance. Streaming wasn't simply another way to watch television. It was changing how people watched television. Then Netflix almost destroyed itself. Most people have never heard of Quickster. That's understandable. Netflix would probably prefer it that way. In 2011, Reed Hastings announced a plan that sounded logical on paper. The DVD business and the streaming business would become separate companies. Netflix would focus on streaming. DVDs would move to a new brand called Quickster. Customers hated it immediately. The backlash was brutal. Separate websites, separate billing, separate queues, confusion everywhere. Millions of users complained. Investors panicked. Netflix stock lost roughly 75% of its value from previous highs. 3/4 of the company's market value vanished. Think about how absurd that is. One of the most successful technology companies in history nearly blew itself up because of a decision that survived only a few weeks. Today, people remember Netflix as a company that always seemed one step ahead. In 2011, it looked completely lost. The company reversed the decision. Quickster disappeared. The damage remained. For a while, it genuinely looked like Netflix had made a historic mistake. Then it doubled down. Not on DVDs, not on licensing, on original content. That's where House of Cards enters the story. People remember House of Cards because it succeeded. The more interesting part is how Netflix approved it. Traditional television executives relied heavily on instinct, pilot episodes, focus groups, industry experience. Netflix relied on data. The company knew users liked political dramas. It knew they watched Kevin Spacey projects. It knew they watched David Fincher projects. Instead of asking whether audiences might like the show, Netflix asked whether the numbers already suggested they would. Then it reportedly committed around $100 million before a single episode aired. In 2011, that sounded reckless. Traditional networks rarely made commitments anywhere close to that size without testing the waters first. Netflix skipped the normal process entirely. The company trusted its data more than most executives trusted their instincts. The gamble worked. House of Cards became a hit. Subscriber growth accelerated. Wall Street noticed. Hollywood noticed. And for the first time, Netflix stopped looking like a company adapting to the future and started looking like a company creating it. But while Netflix was celebrating, Google was facing a completely different challenge. The company had already won the battle for online video. The question now was whether online video would become a bigger business than traditional entertainment. That sounds obvious today. It wasn't obvious then. By 2010, YouTube users watched more than 2 billion videos every day. 2 years later, that number had doubled. Every minute brought more uploads, then more, then even more. Eventually, users were uploading hundreds of hours of content every minute. Google wasn't sitting around regretting Netflix. The company had built one of the most powerful attention machines in human history. But something unusual was happening. YouTube and Netflix were quietly creating two completely different internets. One rewarded creators, the other rewarded content libraries. One created YouTubers, the other created binge watchers. One was built around discovery, the other around retention. Google understood discovery better than anyone. Netflix was beginning to understand retention better than anyone. And that distinction became incredibly important, because attention is valuable. Keeping attention is even more valuable. Then Hollywood made a mistake that would eventually cost billions. For years, major studios licensed content to Netflix for surprisingly small amounts of money. Many executives saw streaming as extra revenue. Easy money. Old content sitting in archives suddenly generated new cash. Sounds smart. The problem was that every licensing deal taught consumers a new habit. Open Netflix. Browse, watch, repeat. Open Netflix. Browse, watch, repeat. Millions of people repeated the same behavior month after month until it became automatic. Some of the same companies that licensed content to Netflix later spent billions trying to rebuild those audiences inside their own streaming services. Disney, Warner Brothers, NBC Universal. They weren't simply competing against Netflix. They were competing against consumer behavior. And consumer behavior is one of the hardest things in business to change. By the time many studios understood what streaming was becoming, Netflix already had a massive head start. Then the numbers became impossible to ignore. In 2013, Netflix had roughly 44 million subscribers globally. By the end of the decade, that number exceeded 167 million. More than 120 million new subscribers in just a few years. At the same time, content spending exploded, around $2.4 billion annually, then $6 billion, then $10 billion. eventually more than $17 billion every year dedicated to content. The company that once looked like a DVD rental service was suddenly spending at a level that rivaled the largest players in Hollywood. And here's the irony. A little over a decade earlier, Netflix had been willing to sell itself for roughly $50 million. $50 million. By the late 2000s, the company was worth tens of billions, one of the most dramatic value increases in modern business history. But here's where the story becomes genuinely fascinating. While Netflix was transforming entertainment, Google was quietly transforming the rest of the internet. Android became the world's dominant mobile operating system. Chrome became the world's most popular browser. Search remained dominant. Gmail exploded. Maps exploded. YouTube exploded. Google wasn't losing. In fact, from almost any business perspective, Google was winning everywhere. Yet one piece was missing: subscription entertainment. The company owned how people discovered information. It owned how people navigated the web. It owned how people watched free video. What it didn't own was where millions of people spent entire evenings watching premium content. Netflix owned that. And that raises an uncomfortable question. What if Google had managed to combine both worlds? Search, Chrome, Android, YouTube, Netflix. Stop for a second and think about what that combination actually means. Google knows what you're searching for. YouTube knows what you're watching. Netflix knows what you're binge-watching. Android knows where you're consuming content. Chrome knows how you're navigating the internet. That's not simply a technology company. That's the closest thing the internet has ever seen to a complete map of human attention, search behavior, viewing behavior, browsing behavior, entertainment behavior, all connected. And that's why this story isn't really about a missed acquisition. Google didn't almost buy a streaming company. It almost bought an entire layer of the future. But here's the twist. There's no guarantee that future would have worked. Most people assume successful companies automatically become more successful after acquisitions. History says otherwise. Many acquisitions destroy the very thing that made a company valuable in the first place. Netflix became famous because it took risks, massive risks, original content, international expansion, huge spending, constant experimentation. Would those same decisions have survived inside one of the largest technology companies in the world? Maybe, maybe not. The Netflix that approved House of Cards might not exist. The Netflix that approved Stranger Things might not exist. The Netflix that took a chance on Squid Game might not exist. Independence gave Netflix freedom. Freedom gave Netflix growth. Growth gave Netflix influence. And influence helped reshape entertainment for an entire generation. Which brings us back to Google's decision in 2006. Google bought YouTube for $1.65 billion. Today, almost everyone agrees it was one of the greatest acquisitions in technology history, which is exactly why this story feels so strange, because Google may have been completely right and still passed on something just as important, not because it failed to see the future, because there were two futures, one built around creators, one built around streaming, one built around discovery, one built around retention. One future became YouTube, the other became Netflix. Google bought one, Netflix built the other. And for a brief moment, before streaming wars, before influencers, before binge-watching became normal, and before billions of hours of video were consumed every day, Google could have owned both. And if that had happened, the internet we know today might look completely different.
Thank you so much for listening to this audiobook. I truly hope these words inspired you, motivated you, and gave you something valuable to take with you into everyday life. If you enjoyed this recording, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and explore my other inspiring audiobooks created to support your growth, mindset, and motivation. Your support means a lot and helps me create more content for listeners like you. See you in the next audiobook.